The bell of St. Botolph's had been, for as long as anyone in Flaxborough could remember, a dependable herald of the parish's routine, the auditory punctuation to life's smaller ceremonies. It rang for fêtes, funerals, and the occasional victory at the bowls club. It had, in its own modest way, become part of the town's nervous system. That was why, on the morning of the harvest fair, its silence seemed somehow improper, an absence that people noticed without quite meaning to. Reverend Melling, who had been rehearsing his opening remarks by the vicarage gate, realized first that something was amiss. He glanced up toward the tower, lips moving faintly as though he might coax the bell into obedience. When it did not oblige, he frowned, not with alarm, but with a quiet irritation that was quickly disguised by the sort of smile vicars are taught early in life to maintain in the face of disaster. Around him the fair unfolded with its usual mixture of piety and mischief. Mrs. Pargeter, guardian of the honey store, had already begun an argument about jar placement with Mrs. Teazle from the post office, while Councillor Chubb was attempting to persuade the beer tent's organizer that a sample was essential to quality assurance. The organist, Mr. Larch, was holding forth to anyone within earshot on the subject of rural decay. When at last the raffle was due to commence, there was a brief pause, an expectant hush. Then nothing. The crowd looked collectively upward, puzzled. "Perhaps the wind's wrong," ventured Mrs. Pargeter. "Sound travels strangely this time of year." "Wind's not to blame," said Mr. Larch, his eyes narrowing. "That bell's not rung. I'd stake my hymn book on it." Reverend Melling excused himself, murmuring something about checking the rope. He crossed the garden with the brisk, careful tread of a man accustomed to concealing anxiety beneath duty. By the time he returned, several theories had sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Someone whispered that a boy had been seen climbing the tower the previous evening. Another claimed the clapper had fallen clean out years ago and no one had noticed. Mrs. Teazle, ever helpful, said she had heard there'd been odd goings-on at the vicarage lately, though what sort of goings-on she could not specify. When Inspector Purbright's small grey Morris came to a dignified halt by the hedge, it was not because he expected to find anything serious. Rather, his instincts, honed by years of municipal drama, recognized that where the innocent gathered in anxious clusters, there was always something to learn. "Bell trouble, sir," Sergeant Love observed. "Ah," said Purbright, stepping out. "A silent peal. There's poetry in that." He made no attempt to interfere. Instead, he listened, an activity at which he excelled, and which, in Flaxborough, was usually more revealing than any formal inquiry. Each account of the bell's failure differed subtly from the last, growing more definite the farther it strayed from fact. By the fourth telling, the rope had been cut neat as tailor's thread, and the vicar had gone white as communion linen. Reverend Melling, reappearing, confirmed that the rope had indeed come loose. "Quite perished," he explained. "Old hemp, you know. I'll have it replaced before Sunday." "Perished," repeated Councillor Chubb, nodding with relief. "Just wear and tear, nothing sinister. A pity we can't say the same for certain members of the parish council." There was polite laughter. Purbright smiled faintly, but said nothing. His gaze had strayed to the Reverend's shoes, lightly dusted with a pale residue, finer than tower grime. Vestry chalk, perhaps. A small detail, but one that lingered in his mind like a note half heard. He made a circuit of the garden, pausing now and again to examine the tower's base, the grass near the path, the faint indentations left by someone's boots, larger than the vicar's, he noticed, and oddly close to the tool shed. But it was, after all, a public day. One could hardly exclude footprints from a fair. By afternoon, the fair resumed its familiar rhythm. The cake competition was won, inevitably, by Miss Parbeter's lemon drizzle, and Mrs. Pargeter's jam refused, as always, to set properly. The bell's failure had already become a story told with cheerful exaggeration. A little mishap, nothing more. Yet beneath the chatter there was a faint unease, a shared awareness that something ordinary had failed to behave as it should. As he left, Purbright paused by the vicarage gate. Through the open study window drifted the faint sound of drawers closing, a soft thud, then silence. He glanced toward the tower once more, its weathered stone catching the late afternoon light. "Funny thing, sir," said Love as they reached the car, "how a bell that doesn't ring can cause such a stir." Purbright considered this. "Indeed, Love, absence often tolls louder than presence." He drove off slowly, the Morris humming with polite restraint. Behind them, the laughter of the fair mingled with the faint rustle of leaves, and above it all, the tower of St. Botolph's stood watchful and mute, its silence not quite complete, and certainly not forgotten. By Monday morning, the silence of the vicarage bell had been replaced by the far louder clamour of conversation. In Flaxborough, gossip travelled with the efficiency of a well-funded postal service and the discretion of a brass band. It began, as many such things did, in the post office itself. Mrs. Teazle, who regarded information as both her duty and her currency, had already told at least 7 customers that the bell rope had not merely frayed, but been cut, cleanly, deliberately. And, she added in a voice lowered to a scandalized whisper, as if by someone with rather steady hands. Her audience varied in their reactions. Mr. Prowse, the undertaker, found it a pity but unsurprising, as he believed all ropes tended toward moral decay. Miss Pargeter, on the other hand, gasped as if she had personally been sawn through the middle. By elevenses, the story had expanded to include the possibility of a midnight intruder, a mysterious shadow seen near the churchyard wall, and a disagreement between the vicar and the new church warden over the harvest fair accounts. At the police station, Sergeant Love was reading through a stack of local correspondence when Purbright entered, hat in hand, and a look of distant amusement on his face. "Morning, Love. Anything momentous?" "Only this, sir." Love held out a folded note, smudged at the edges. "Delivered by hand. Says the vicar's bell rope was tampered with for good reason." No name. Purbright read the words twice, then placed the note gently on the desk. Flaxborough's conscience has found paper again. How refreshing. Think it's serious? "I think," said Purbright mildly, "it's sincere, which is rather more dangerous." He requested that the note be dusted for fingerprints, knowing full well it would yield none but Love's. Then, putting on his coat, he remarked, "I believe we should call upon Reverend Melling. He may have more to tell us than he intends." The vicarage, that afternoon, appeared blameless enough, its ivy trim immaculate, its windows politely curtained. Mrs. Melling received them in the parlour, where the smell of lavender polish competed faintly with that of burnt toast. She was a small, pale woman, her manner one of constant apology for the existence of furniture. "The Reverend is in his study," she said, smoothing a non-existent crease from her skirt. "He's been rather distracted since the fair." When Melling appeared, he looked more composed than his wife, but less certain than a clergyman ought. His hands, clasped together, betrayed a faint tremor. "I'm afraid," he began, "that the whole matter has been somewhat exaggerated. The rope was old, very old. I examined it myself." "Indeed?" Purbright's tone was friendly, conversational. "You're handy with tools, then?" Melling hesitated. I prefer to rely on others normally, but the tower isn't what it once was. One can't always wait for the diocesan carpenter." As he spoke, Purbright's eyes wandered. not rudely, merely observantly. A small length of twine sat on the window-sill, freshly cut, its ends clean and sharp. Near it, a key ring missing one key. He said nothing of either. "Tell me, Reverend," he asked instead, "who has access to the bell tower?" "Only myself, my verger, and Mr. Dane, the new warden. A most reliable man, though perhaps a little officious."
Officiousness, said Purbright, is a virtue much prized by authority and rarely enjoyed by those subject to it. Mrs. Melling interjected, almost too quickly.
"Mr. Dane is very devout, Inspector. He insists on balancing every penny of the church fund personally." "Ah!" said Purbright, smiling faintly.
An admirable thoroughness.
"I hope he extends it to his own accounts." There was a pause, brief but brittle. Mrs. Melling glanced toward her husband, who looked down at his clasped hands.
Love, sensing the moment teetering on discomfort, asked whether the tower door was ever left unlocked. "Never," Melling said at once.
"The key is kept—" He stopped, faltered, and corrected himself. "Was kept in my desk. I seem to have misplaced it, but no doubt it will turn up." Purbright nodded, as though the misplacement of keys were among life's commonest tragedies. "Of course, keys have a will of their own. They vanish when least convenient." As they left, Mrs. Melling followed them to the door, lowering her voice. "Inspector, my husband has been under strain. The parish committee— There's been talk about funds missing from the choir repairs."
"I assure you it's nonsense." Purbright inclined his head politely.
"Gossip often is. Yet, curiously, it's nearly always accurate in direction, if not in detail. Outside, the November air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves. Love exhaled heavily. Seems a storm in a teacup, sir. Frayed rope, missing key, and a parish ledger with a few shillings astray." Purbright walked a few steps before replying. "Yes, love, but storms, as you'll recall, are sometimes forecast by very small clouds." By evening, the tale had grown still grander. The bell rope was said to have been cut with surgical precision, and one version even claimed that a ghostly hand had been seen pulling it. Mrs. Teasle was overheard in the Crown and Cushion declaring you wouldn't be surprised if it had something to do with that dreadful business at the choir fund in a town where conversation was both pastime and weapon. Silence could not endure long. Yet it was precisely the silences, the ones that came after certain names were spoken, or when Mrs. Melling passed through the market, that drew Purbright's interest most. For he knew better than most that in Flaxborough the truth seldom shouted. It whispered, politely, persistently, and always just out of earshot. The next morning dawned with that faint, resigned greyness peculiar to small English towns after a weekend of mild excitement. The newspapers, having no local correspondent to embellish matters, mentioned the harvest fair only in passing, an agreeable occasion marred by a small technical failure. But in Flaxborough itself, the talk had lost none of its savour. The bell that hadn't rung was now the bell that everyone had a theory about. Inspector Purbright, who liked his mornings orderly and his tea unhurried, had both interrupted by a call from Superintendent Harcourt.
"You've stirred them up again, Purbright," Harcourt said in the weary tone of a man who had long since given up expecting tranquillity.
"Something about a vandalized church and missing funds?"
"Can't the clergy keep their finances as clean as their consciences?"
"I believe," Purbright replied, "the matter is less dramatic than the reports suggest, though perhaps rather more revealing." "Revealing of what?" "Human nature, Superintendent. It does enjoy its small rehearsals for tragedy." He hung up, not unkindly, and found Love waiting with his notebook and an expression of hopeful purpose. "So Reverend Melling asked if we might drop by again. Said he'd found the key to the tower." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "How thoughtful of Providence." The vicarage seemed quieter that day, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Mrs. Melling met them at the door, her smile more brittle than before. "My husband's in the garden, Inspector. He said he needed air." They found Reverend Melling near the rose border, pruning without conviction. He looked up with the tentative relief of a man who has rehearsed his honesty.
"Ah, Inspector, yes, the key."
It was in a drawer after all. "Silly of me." He produced it with an awkward flourish, a single brass key on a piece of green string. "Excellent," Purbright said, taking it lightly. A reassuring end to one mystery, at least.
"May we see the tower?"
The vicar hesitated only a fraction before nodding. "Of course. Though you'll find little of interest up there, I assure you. The ascent was narrow and airless." Love went first, his boots thudding softly on the worn steps. The air smelled of dust, wax, and age. Near the top, the rope hung neatly coiled, recently replaced, its fibres pale and new. Beside it, the old rope lay bundled in a corner, a rough, frayed tangle that looked harmless enough until Purbright knelt to examine the end. "Frayed, you said, Reverend?" he asked without turning. "Quite so. See how threadbare." "Threadbare indeed," Purbright murmured.
"And very straight-edged, wouldn't you say?"
Almost as if the threads had lost patience with natural wear. Melling's silence was the kind that tried to sound like agreement. Love, meanwhile, was gazing at the beams above.
"So someone's been up here lately."
Fresh footprints in the dust. The vicar's attempt at laughter came out thin. "The verger, no doubt. He checks the mechanism after storms." "Thoughtful man," Purbright said mildly.
"And the verger, where might we find him today?"
"At his brother's farm, I imagine. He was quite shaken by the fair, feels responsible for the bell's failure, an admirable sense of duty." Purbright straightened, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Tell me, Reverend, would you say Mr. Dane, the new warden, takes an equal interest in the tower?" Melling paused, then said carefully, "Mr. Dane has
"Views about stewardship.
He feels the church should modernize."
Electric bells even. Progress," Purbright said.
"Descending the steps, has an unfortunate habit of arriving where it isn't wanted." When they reached the vicarage garden again, Mrs. Melling appeared with a tray of tea, her hands steady but her eyes watchful. Purbright accepted a cup, declining sugar. "Your husband tells us he's rediscovered his key," he said lightly. "Yes." She placed her cup down with care. He was so relieved. He's been quite distracted since the fair. People can be
"Unkind. Flaxborough's kindness," Purbright said, "is merely a question of timing."
It always returns, eventually. Mrs. Melling gave a faint smile, but her eyes flicked toward the study window. Inside, Purbright noticed, the curtains were drawn, though the room was unlit. "Forgive me," he said gently. "Does your husband often work with the curtains closed?" "Only when he's writing sermons," she replied too quickly. "He says it helps him think." Purbright inclined his head. "Sensible precaution. Reflection can be so easily interrupted by daylight." As they left, he paused by the gate.
"Love, did you notice the new rope?"
"Bright as hope, that one." "Yes, sir." "And the old one? Darkened by years, yes, but its cut looked rather immediate. Not what I'd call the work of time." Love frowned.
"You think the Reverend—" "I think," Purbright interrupted softly, "that everyone in that house is telling the truth in small pieces."
"We simply haven't the connecting glue yet." They drove to the railway station next. Purbright's curiosity had been stirred not by the bell itself, but by something Mrs. Melling had let slip, a mention of unkind people. He wanted to know what sort of unkindness had recently passed through Flaxborough's veins. The station porter, an old acquaintance, greeted them with cheerful suspicion. "Morning, Inspector."
"No trouble, I hope."
"Merely inquiry," said Purbright. "Do you recall anyone posting a letter here late on Saturday evening? A woman, perhaps?" The porter scratched his head.
"Aye, that'd be after the last train."
Dark hat kept her face down. "Not one of ours, I'd say. Left quick as a whistle after dropping it." Purbright nodded thoughtfully.
"Thank you."
"You've a remarkable memory for faces unseen." "It's the unseen ones cause trouble," said the porter with grim satisfaction. As they returned to the car, Love looked puzzled. "A letter, sir? To do with the bell?" "Possibly nothing," Purbright said. But in towns like ours, the post is often a confessional with better stationery. Back at the station office, the day grew long with paperwork and routine. Yet, even amid the hum of typewriters and the faint aroma of overbrewed tea, Purbright's mind returned again and again to the vicarage, the mislaid key, the cut rope, the nervous wife, and the invisible letter writer. None of it amounted to crime yet, but in Flaxborough, crimes seldom began as such. They began as small salvations, acts of concealment mistaken for kindness, little lies told for love or pride or the illusion of peace. Purbright leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, and murmured, when the bell failed to ring, perhaps it wasn't only the rope that gave way. Perhaps it was something rather older. Love looked up from his desk. "Sir?" "Nothing," Purbright said, only thinking how silence, once invited, tends to make itself at home. Outside, the late afternoon light faded behind the church spire. And somewhere beyond that, in the narrow vicarage garden, a faint chime sounded, the whisper of metal against metal, like a bell testing its voice again, uncertain whether to speak. By Tuesday afternoon, Flaxborough's restlessness had taken a practical turn. Councillor Chubb, who prided himself on brisk conclusions and the efficient suppression of mystery, announced at the Rotary luncheon that the business of the vicarage bell was mechanical, not moral. He made this declaration over a plate of shepherd's pie, and to considerable applause. Nothing so comforted Flaxborough society as the reassurance that any oddity could be traced to wear, weather, or incompetence. Inspector Purbright, invited to the same luncheon out of courtesy, offered no objection. He listened while Chubb expounded on the frailty of hemp and the dangers of ecclesiastical neglect. "We've all been too ready," said Chubb, dabbing his mouth, "to suspect wrongdoing. It's a rope, that's all. You leave a rope long enough and it rots. Nothing criminal about nature, Inspector?" "Nothing at all," said Purbright mildly, though his tone had the faint dryness of a man quoting scripture to an atheist. Afterwards, as they walked back to the station, Sergeant Love remarked, "He's got a point, sir. That rope was old. Could have just given out." "It could," Purbright agreed. "And the vicar could have misplaced his key, and a stranger could have posted an anonymous letter for purely recreational purposes. The universe is full of coincidences, Love. The trouble is, they so seldom occur alone." Love sighed. "Still, the superintendent will be pleased."
Case closed, no scandal, no paperwork. Indeed.
Though one does feel a faint sympathy for the truth, forever abandoned for the sake of administrative peace. When they reached the police station, a small envelope awaited Purbright on his desk. No name, no return address, just his title in a neat, slanting hand. Inside was a single scrap of lined paper bearing 6 words, "Ask about the choir fund first." He read it twice before slipping it into his pocket. "Love," he said quietly, "would you be so kind as to fetch the church accounts from the vestry? I fancy another look." At the vicarage, the Reverend received them with cautious good humour. "Still curious about our little mishap, Inspector?"
"I do hope the town hasn't turned it into one of its Greek tragedies." "Not quite," said Purbright, smiling.
"More a pastoral comedy, though one hears whispers about the choir fund." Melling's composure faltered, like a curtain tugged by a breeze.
"Ah, yes, the accounts."
"We've had minor confusion, I confess. The diocesan treasurer asked for clarification about a payment."
"Easily corrected." "Splendid," said Purbright, producing the key he had borrowed from the station clerk. "And Mr. Dane, he oversees such matters?"
The vicar nodded stiffly. "He insists upon it. Accuracy, he says, is next to godliness." Mrs. Melling entered with tea, her movements careful, her face pale. "You'll forgive my husband, Inspector," she said, setting down the tray.
"He's not been sleeping well."
"The fare took more out of him than he admits." Melling looked at her sharply, then forced a smile. "My dear, the inspector doesn't need my medical history." "On the contrary," Purbright said softly, "fatigue can be most instructive. It tells us where conscience does not. For a moment, Only the clock spoke. Its tick filled the room with the measured politeness of time unwilling to intrude. Then Melling said, "Inspector, may I ask, do you suspect some crime in this?" It was an old rope, nothing more. "Possibly," said Purbright, "though one finds it curious that the rope's fibres appear to have been cut rather than torn."
"I've sent a small piece to the laboratory."
"Their verdict may settle the matter." The vicar's teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. "Surely that's unnecessary." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, "but unnecessary things often reveal the most." He stood, thanking them both with his usual gentleness. Mrs. Melling followed him to the door. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper.
"Please don't think ill of my husband, Inspector. He only wanted to protect the parish." "From what, Mrs. Melling?"
She looked down, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "From embarrassment, from talk. People can be cruel." Purbright regarded her for a moment, then said quietly, "Cruelty in Flaxborough seldom announces itself with shouting. It prefers to smile." He left her standing there, her face pale as the lace curtain beside her. That evening, in his office, he unwrapped the fragment of rope Love had brought. The cut was indeed too clean, the edge almost polished by a sharp blade. He placed it beside the anonymous note, the two small pieces of evidence lying together like conspirators awaiting confession. "Frayed rope," he murmured, "or frayed nerve." Love, tidying the files, looked up. "Sir?" Just thinking aloud.
"There's a kind of symmetry about it."
The bell was meant to sound at the fair, the parish's great moment of cheer, and it failed.
"Rather symbolic, don't you think?" "Of what?"
Of someone trying very hard to keep something quiet. Outside, the fog had begun to drift in from the river, softening the lamps and swallowing the edges of sound. Flaxborough looked, as it often did, innocent and half asleep. But Purbright knew better.
He always did.
The town had its way of wrapping mischief in decency and lies in politeness. And somewhere, behind the lace and the lavender, a blade had been put to use not in anger, but in fear. He turned down the lamp and closed his notebook. "Let them have their frayed rope," he murmured. "Soon enough, the knot will show." The following morning found Inspector Purbright in the market square, pausing by the greengrocer's stall to exchange the usual civilities. He moved without urgency, as though the rhythm of the town itself dictated his pace. Flaxborough at 9:30 was a picture of innocence, bakers setting out trays of pastries, schoolchildren trailing behind late mothers, the faint toll of St. Botolph's clock marking an hour that everyone already knew. Yet beneath the calm, Purbright sensed the faint hum of self-consciousness that followed any local scandal. People nodded to him a fraction too quickly, smiled a fraction too long. In a town that valued privacy, the presence of the law, even polite, soft-spoken law was rarely neutral. It was Miss Purbright who approached him, a small woman in mauve gloves and an expression that suggested permanent grievance. "Inspector," she began, "I don't like to intrude upon official business, but something rather curious has occurred at the vicarage. Not a crime, of course. Well, I shouldn't think so, but peculiar." Purbright inclined his head. "Peculiarities are often worth noting, Miss Purbright. They tend to point in unexpected directions. What has gone astray?" She lowered her voice, though there was no one near enough to overhear. "My pudding plate, Inspector. I lent it to Mrs. Melling for the fair. She was to return it Monday. But when I called yesterday, she seemed flustered, said it had been misplaced."
"Misplaced?"
"A plate I've had 20 years. It's quite distinctive, a blue edge and a little chip, shaped like a crescent moon. I only mention it because, well, one never knows." "One never does," said Purbright, his tone grave, but his eyes quietly amused. "You're sure it wasn't broken?"
"Oh, no, she'd have said so."
I could tell she was hiding something.
"I dare say she's been distracted since that business with the bell."
Her hands were trembling. "Ah," murmured Purbright.
"Thank you, Miss Purbright.
"You've been most helpful. If your plate should turn up, I shall regard that as a sign Providence still keeps an eye on crockery." She departed, satisfied she had assisted justice. Purbright watched her go, then turned toward the vicarage, his expression thoughtful. When he arrived, Mrs. Melling greeted him at the door with visible hesitation.
"Inspector again?
Is there more trouble?" "None at all," he said pleasantly. "Merely a domestic inquiry. I've been told that a pudding plate has gone missing. Miss Parbyter seems most anxious about it." The vicar's wife flushed.
"Oh, that. Yes, terribly unfortunate. I was sure I'd packed it after the fair. We had so many dishes to sort, you see. I've looked everywhere." "Everywhere?"
Purbright asked gently. "Even in places one might not expect. The garden, for instance?"
"The garden?"
She frowned, then quickly smiled.
"Oh, no, Inspector."
"I hardly think I'd take tableware into the garden." "Of course not," said Purbright, nodding as though she'd confirmed a hypothesis.
"I only wondered."
"One hears odd things, plates, ropes, even keys, turning up where logic has no jurisdiction." She gave a small, nervous laugh. "You have such a way of putting things, Inspector."
"It all sounds like a sermon," he smiled.
"Let's hope it doesn't end like one." She hesitated, then said, "You may look if you wish, but truly, it's not here." Purbright declined the invitation.
"I've no doubt of that."
"But should it appear, do let me know. I find lost objects rather enlightening." He left her standing uncertainly in the doorway and walked back toward the churchyard. The grass was damp from morning rain, and the air held that faint, metallic tang of autumn decay. Near the path to the vestry door, he paused, stooped, and examined the ground. A small scatter of pottery fragments, white with a faint trace of blue, lay half hidden among the weeds. He touched one lightly with his gloved finger, studying the curved edge. The break was clean, deliberate. A few yards away stood Mr. Dane, the church warden, his tall frame silhouetted against the tower wall. He was a neat man, too neat, Purbright thought, his tie perfectly centered, his shoes aggressively polished. "Morning, Inspector," Dane said, forcing a smile. "I hear you're still poking around our little bell business."
"Waste of your time, if you ask me."
The Reverend admitted it was his mistake. Rope too old. End of story. "Endings," said Purbright, "are often declared before all the pages are turned." Dane gave a dry chuckle. "You sound like one of his sermons." "I'm told that's contagious." Purbright's gaze drifted to the vicarage window, where a pale curtain stirred. "Tell me, Mr. Dane, has the parish fund matter been resolved?" Dane's smile faltered. "You've been listening to gossip. It's tedious, Inspector." "There was never any missing money, only a misfiled receipt." "Ah, the sort of clerical error the Almighty forgives easily." Dane's expression hardened.
"You may find amusement in these things. I don't. The church is already too vulnerable to mockery."
"Quite right," Purbright said mildly. "Still, I do find it remarkable how often mockery and truth take the same road." He left Dane standing there, jaw clenched, and returned to his car. On the passenger seat lay his small notebook, open to a page headed Minor Irregularities. Beneath it, he wrote 3 items: the bell rope, cut; the key, mislaid; the plate, broken, hidden. He tapped the pencil against the paper, murmuring, "3 small lies rarely coexist without reason." At the station, Sergeant Love was deciphering the results from the laboratory. "The rope fibres show marks of a sharp blade, sir. Razor or shears." "Clean slice," Purbright nodded. "Thank you, Love. Keep that quiet for now." "No point alarming the godly." Love hesitated. "You think the vicar did it?" "I think someone wished to silence a sound, one that symbolized exposure, perhaps. Bells don't summon guilt, Love, but they do have an inconvenient habit of marking beginnings." He closed his notebook and leaned back, watching the evening light fade across the window. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 6, steady, untroubled, entirely obedient to time. Yet Purbright could not help but imagine another sound overlaying it, a bell that refused to ring, a voice that trembled into silence, and the faint crack of pottery breaking under cautious hands. Flaxborough's mysteries, he reflected, never shouted. They whispered from kitchen cupboards, from misplaced ledgers, from small lies told between married faces. And now, perhaps, from a pudding plate no longer whole. The next day broke under a low, pewter sky that pressed upon the roofs of Flaxborough like a reminder that the season had turned. The market was quieter than usual, the chatter subdued, though that only meant the gossip had found a more private route. By now the matter of the vicarage bell had become a kind of local parable. It was spoken of not as an event, but as a symptom, something that proved what each speaker already believed about the town, its clergy, and the general decline of good behaviour. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had received something tangible at last, an anonymous letter, delivered to the station by morning post, typed on coarse paper with a worn ribbon. Its message was brief: "You'll find truth nearer the pulpit than the tower." There was no signature, but the phrasing had a sort of self-importance about it, a moralist's relish for ambiguity. He turned it over in his hand, then set it down beside the broken fragment of the pudding plate, which still lay in its paper envelope. Sergeant Love entered, rubbing his hands against the chill. "Morning, sir." The postman mentioned he'd seen Mrs. Melling out early, walking toward the station.
"Odd hour for her," he said. Purbright's eyes lingered on the letter. Indeed, did he happen to mention whether she carried anything?
"Only her handbag."
"Small one, brown." He thought she looked.
Well, not upset exactly. More like someone who'd already decided to be. "Decided to be," Purbright repeated softly.
A useful distinction. He rose, adjusting his coat.
"Let's pay a visit to the post office."
"Love, I fancy hearing what Mrs. Teasel's moral barometer has been measuring this morning." Mrs. Teasel greeted them with the air of a woman who had been waiting all morning to be consulted.
"Inspector, Sergeant, I thought you'd be along. I said to Mr. Prowse only yesterday, this won't end with the bell, mark my words. And here you are." "You are rarely wrong, Mrs. Teasel," Purbright said with gentle sincerity. "Did you happen to notice Mrs. Melling here today?" "Oh, indeed I did. Came in just after 8. Posted something registered, though she wouldn't say to where. I asked, purely out of professional concern, but she smiled that little nervous smile of hers and said it was a private letter. Then she dropped her pen and I saw her hand shaking. Did she wait for a receipt?"
"Oh, yes, very precise."
"Signed it E. Melling as neat as anything. But she left quick, almost ran, I'd say. Not like her at all." "Thank you, Mrs. Teasel," said Purbright. "You've been a model of discretion, as always." Mrs. Teasel beamed, entirely missing the irony.
"It's my duty, Inspector."
"Confidentiality above all." As they left, Love asked, "Think the letter was to the diocese, sir? Maybe to explain about the missing funds?" "Possibly," Purbright said. "Or possibly it wasn't meant to explain at all, merely to divert." They crossed the square to the church. Inside, the air was still and faintly cold, filled with the smell of candle wax and damp wood. A few kneeling parishioners murmured their prayers, but Reverend Melling was not among them. Instead, Mr. Dane was standing near the lectern, supervising the polishing of the brass rail with the intensity of a man conducting moral surgery. "Inspector," he said, straightening, "still pursuing your investigation, I see. Though I fail to understand the necessity. The vicar has enough burdens without this intrusion." "Burden is a relative term, Mr. Dane," Purbright said mildly. "I wonder, does he share your opinion?" Dane frowned.
"He's exhausted." Can you blame him? Half the town whispering, "Letters to the bishop, his wife unwell, it's a cruel business." "Letters to the bishop?"
Purbright repeated. Dane hesitated. "Oh, surely you knew. He wrote one himself after the fair. A full account of the incident. The bishop's secretary confirmed receipt this morning." "How diligent of him," Purbright said softly. "Would it be impertinent to ask when this letter was sent?" "Monday evening, I believe. Mrs. Melling posted it." Purbright's expression hardly altered, but a faint gleam of interest stirred in his eyes. "Indeed, then one must admire her efficiency. She seems to have had quite the week for correspondence." Leaving Dane to his polishing, Purbright walked toward the vestry. There, the faint smell of damp paper met him, a scent he had learned to associate with half-told truths. On the desk lay several open ledgers, the ink still faintly smudged, as though recently handled. Among them was a page dated 3 months earlier listing donations to the choir fund. Several entries were neatly crossed out, and beside one, in small, feminine handwriting, was the note, "Repaid in full." He closed the book carefully and returned to the nave. Love, waiting near the door, looked uneasy.
"So if the vicar's wife's been paying back church money, that means, Purbright said, someone took it first."
The question is whether it was theft or merely generosity gone astray. As they stepped outside, a thin drizzle had begun to fall, misting the churchyard in a fine haze. Across the lane, the vicarage curtains twitched, and for a moment Purbright caught sight of Mrs. Melling's pale face behind the glass before it vanished again. That afternoon, back at the station, a telegram arrived from the diocesan office. It confirmed that the Reverend's letter had indeed been received, postmarked, the previous evening, and that it contained certain admissions of fiscal irregularity, though the details were ambiguous and couched in spiritual terms. Purbright folded the telegram and slipped it into his pocket. "There we have it, love. The Reverend has confessed, though only to his superior, not to the law." Love frowned. "So he took the money, sir?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps he merely accepted the blame for another's actions. There's a curious chivalry in that household." Toward dusk, Purbright returned alone to the vicarage. This time, the Reverend was waiting in his study, the curtains drawn tight, a single lamp burning low. His expression was one of calm resignation. "I suppose you've heard," he said quietly. "Yes, I've written to the bishop." "Explained everything?" "Then you'll save me the trouble of asking," Purbright replied.
"The funds?"
Melling nodded. "A small loan, temporary, taken without proper authorization. It was repaid before discovery."
"I acted alone. An admirable confession," Purbright said gently.
Almost too neat. Melling's eyes flickered. "You doubt me?" "I doubt only the arithmetic of conscience, Reverend. It seldom balances so perfectly." Melling smiled faintly. "You're a shrewd man, Inspector. But this is no great crime. The bell, these rumours, they'll fade." Purbright regarded him steadily. "They will, yes. Bells are forgiving things. But not ropes."
"And not letters." The vicar's composure faltered just for a breath before returning.
"Good evening, Inspector." Purbright inclined his head, accepting dismissal. Yet, as he left, his gaze lingered once more on the desk, on a half-burned scrap of paper resting in the grate. He could just make out the words, "Choir Fund, C-note enclosed." The rest was ash. Outside, the drizzle had deepened into rain. Purbright stood for a moment beneath the eaves, watching it slide down the vicarage windows in restless patterns. Somewhere inside, a woman's voice called softly, then fell silent, and the inspector, with the patience of a man used to waiting for confessions to ripen, murmured, "Other voices indeed." The question was casual, but it landed with visible weight. Melling hesitated. "Occasionally. She likes to feel useful." "And does she perhaps also handle your correspondence?" "I ask only because there's been some confusion over the letters sent to the diocese." Melling's lips parted, then closed again.
I don't recall."
"She may have."
"Why do you ask?"
"No reason of consequence," Purbright said. "Merely that it's admirable how well a marriage can function on shared conscience." Before the Reverend could reply, Mrs. Melling appeared at the far end of the nave, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She froze briefly at the sight of them, then composed herself. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I was just leaving something for the Ladies' Guild. Old hymn books." Purbright inclined his head.
"Ah, the hymns. They do pile up, don't they? One sings them often enough, yet they never seem used." She smiled faintly, though her eyes darted once toward her husband.
"You find meaning everywhere, Inspector. I wish my husband had your confidence." "Confidence," Purbright said, "is merely habit mistaken for certainty." He gestured toward the parcel. "Might I?" She hesitated, but handed it over. Inside lay 3 hymnals, and beneath them a slim folder marked Accounts, Choir Fund. The Reverend's handwriting lined the top page, but beneath it were entries in another hand, finer, more deliberate. He glanced at her without reproach. "Mrs. Melling, it's quite all right."
Accuracy never offends me, her composure wavered. It's just Edward thought it best to tidy things up before anyone else looked. Quite right, Purbright said.
"Tidy books, tidy conscience." He closed the folder and returned it gently. "I'll keep these safe a little longer, if I may. Some truths prefer careful shelving." She nodded, almost in relief. That evening, back at the station, Purbright wrote up his notes. Each line was brief, as though he were cataloguing a pattern rather than a case. The rope cut, not frayed. The plate broken, not lost. The letter sent, not confessed. The fuse removed, not failed. And beneath it, one final entry, each silence answered by another hand. He sat for some time, eyes half closed, listening to the slow tick of the office clock. Somewhere outside, the newly repaired bell tolled the half-hour, its sound clean, almost innocent. Yet to Purbright it carried a faint unease,
as though the town itself had found its voice only to say nothing at all. He leaned back,
murmuring to the empty room. When the righteous falter, they rarely fall. They simply rearrange the truth into something less uncomfortable. Love appeared at the door, holding 2 cups of tea. "Evening, sir. You think it's over now?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Oh, no. I think it's only just begun to sound right. By Wednesday, the fog had lifted from the town, but not from its conversations. The bell rang again each morning at 8, its tone now too perfect, too punctual, like a lie told with unnecessary clarity. Purbright noticed it on his way to the station, the sound echoing down the narrow streets, crisp and hollow. Flaxborough's residents had taken the restoration of their beloved bell as proof that normality had returned, and yet beneath their relief, the gossip had deepened into a quieter, more poisonous sort of interest. They were no longer amused, they were curious. And curiosity in Flaxborough, Purbright knew, was the final stage before accusation. He sat in his office with a cigarette balanced on the edge of an ashtray, the smoke curling upward in thoughtful patterns. "It's not the bell," he said aloud, though only love was present to hear. "It never was. It's the silence that came after it. People will forgive sin more readily than they will forgive secrecy." Love looked up from his paperwork. "And you think someone's still keeping a secret?" "I think," Purbright said, "that someone's trying very hard to preserve the illusion of order, which is usually when things start to unravel." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment, then stood abruptly. "Fetch your notebook, love. We're paying another visit to the vicarage. This time, I should like to test something." Mrs. Melling opened the door before they could knock, as if she had been listening for them. Her face was drawn but composed. "Inspector," she said softly, "my husband is in the study. He's expecting you." Inside, the air was close and faintly scented with old paper. Reverend Melling rose from behind his desk, his expression polite but resigned. "You've chosen an inconvenient day, Inspector. I'm afraid I've rather a lot to do. The diocesan treasurer is arriving next week." "Then this won't take long," Purbright said cheerfully. "I've merely come to see the bell rope. I'm told it's been replaced quite splendidly. Perhaps we might have a small demonstration." The Reverend's hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there, a flicker of uncertainty that made Mrs. Melling glance sharply at him.
"Now?" he asked. "Why not?"
said Purbright, smiling. It's a fine morning for reassurance. Within minutes, they were all standing in the small yard behind the church. The new rope hung freshly white against the dark frame of the tower archway. Purbright gestured politely. "If you do the honours, Reverend." Melling took hold of the rope and pulled once, sharply. The bell above answered with a rich, even tone that seemed to vibrate through the very stones. It was a sound without blemish, too pure, almost defiant. "Splendid," Purbright said. "Perfectly functional."
"And the old rope, did you happen to keep it?"
"It was discarded," Melling replied quickly. "Beyond use." "Ah, pity. Sentimentally speaking, at least." Purbright stepped closer to the base of the tower, his eyes tracing the ground. Then, almost idly, he said, "You'll forgive me, Reverend, if I confess something rather small. I've always had a fondness for small errors, slips, omissions, the things people overlook. They tend to tell me more than the grand gestures." Melling frowned slightly. "I don't follow you. I wouldn't expect you to. Tell me, did you notice that the pudding plate has been found?" Mrs. Melling stiffened. "Found?" "Yes," said Purbright pleasantly. "In the refuse pit behind the vestry. Broken, of course, but interestingly only one edge was chipped. A crescent shape, Miss Parbutter called it. The rest was perfectly intact, as though it had been broken deliberately to preserve the illusion of loss." The silence that followed was delicate, taut as the rope above their heads. Melling's eyes darted once toward his wife before returning to Purbright's face.
"Inspector, are you implying—" "Nothing at all," Purbright interrupted softly.
"I only mention it because I've developed a taste for coincidences. 3, in particular, a bell that would not ring, a plate that vanished, and a rope cut clean through. Each in its way an act of prevention rather than aggression."
"Not destruction, you see." "Silencing," Mrs. Melling spoke suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness.
"You've no right to—" "Perhaps not," said Purbright gently. "But I have reason. You see, I think someone here has mistaken secrecy for virtue. And virtue, once it begins to lie, becomes the most dangerous thing in any parish." Her hands trembled.
"You think
"I think," Purbright said, stepping closer, "that love, when cornered, can do very unlovely things. To protect a husband's name, to spare him shame, to keep the parish's faith intact." Melling's composure crumbled.
"This is absurd. I took the money, yes, but my wife had nothing to do with the bell?"
"The rope? The letters?" Purbright's voice remained calm, almost kind. "No, perhaps not. She merely tried to protect you from discovery by diverting attention, cutting a rope, hiding a plate, sending a letter. Each small, almost tender crime performed in silence." Mrs. Melling's eyes filled, but she said nothing. Melling turned to her, stricken.
"Emily!"
Her answer came as barely a whisper.
"I couldn't let them humiliate you again."
"Not after last year, when they said you misused the choir funds. You were ill, Edward. You were tired."
"I only wanted them to stop talking." "They never stop talking," Purbright said quietly.
"That's why it's best not to feed them." Melling sank onto the garden bench, his face grey. "You'll have to charge her," he said bitterly. "She's confessed. Confessed to loyalty," Purbright replied.
"That isn't a crime. Not yet."
"And I see no advantage in explaining the details to your bishop. After all, the town prefers its scandals unresolved. It gives them something to think about between fetes." For a long while, no one spoke. The bell above them swayed gently in the wind, the rope trembling against the stone. Finally, Purbright glanced at his watch. "Well, I must be going." "Thank you for the demonstration, Reverend. It's always useful to hear what one has been missing." As he walked back toward the gate, Mrs. Melling's voice called softly after him. "Inspector, will they ever stop talking?" He turned, his expression unreadable. "Only when something new begins." The bell gave one last faint chime as he left, a sound that lingered like a breath held too long. It was the sort of morning that looked freshly laundered. The rain had scoured the cobbles clean. The air smelled faintly of soap and stone, and even the pigeons seemed to have regained a sense of decency. Inspector Purbright stood at his office window, watching the square below come to life with a kind of habitual civility. It was Tuesday, market day again, and the rhythm of trade beat on as if the town's conscience had been wiped and rewritten overnight. Sergeant Love arrived balancing 2 cups of tea and the local paper, whose headline read, "Vicarage restored to peace." "All is well," says Reverend.
Love set it down with a shrug.
"Seems they've forgiven him already." Half the parish turned out to ring the new bell yesterday evening. Even Mrs. Teazle's calling it a triumph of faith. Faith, Purbright said, is often the polite term for relief. He turned back to his desk, where a single envelope awaited him, bearing Reverend Melling's careful hand. Inside was a note, brief and formal. "Inspector, my wife and I should be grateful if you would take tea with us this afternoon. There are things best said plainly and only once." Purbright folded it neatly. "It appears," he said, "that redemption requires refreshment. Come along, love. We'd best be punctual. They've had quite enough of lateness in that house." At the vicarage, the drawing-room had been arranged with almost theatrical care. The fire burned gently, the tea set gleamed, and Mrs. Melling sat upright in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. The Reverend, standing by the window, looked thinner, older, but calmer than before. "Inspector," he began, "thank you for coming. We wish to speak with you without misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" said Purbright, taking his seat, is Flaxborough's most renewable resource. "But do go on," Melling managed a faint smile. "You were right, of course. My wife acted rashly out of misguided protection. I allowed it to happen because I lacked the courage to face the consequences of my own weakness. I thought if the matter appeared trivial, mechanical, as Councillor Chubb put it, it might fade quietly.
Instead, it multiplied. Purbright stirred his tea without replying. Mrs. Melling's gaze remained fixed on her cup, though her voice, when it came, was steady.
I thought I could repair things. The rope, the letter, even the plate. It all seemed so small at first. But small things grow heavy, don't they, Inspector?"
"They become evidence, only when examined," Purbright said gently.
"Most lives are built on small deceits. They're what keep society civil." She looked up then, and for the first time there was something like relief in her face. "You're not going to charge us?" "Charge you with what, Mrs. Melling?"
"A misplaced rope? A broken dish?"
The deliberate quieting of an over-enthusiastic bell.
"No jury would convict you without laughing first," the Reverend gave a weary sigh.
"Still, there must be consequence." "There is," Purbright said, setting down his cup. "But not the kind you imagine. You'll go on here, Reverend, preaching gentleness to people who will listen more closely now, not out of respect, but curiosity. They'll remember this as your difficult year. They'll speak of your humility in whispers that conceal delight. And one day, when something else scandalous happens, a councillor's indiscretion or a missing collection tin, they'll look back and say, at least the Melling affair was handled gracefully. That's consequence enough." Melling gave a faint, rueful nod. "You describe human nature with alarming accuracy." "Only from long acquaintance," Purbright replied. "I find sin varies little across professions. It's the paperwork that changes." Love, who had remained uncharacteristically silent, cleared his throat. "If I may, sir, what about Mr. Dane? He's been spreading talk that the church's accounts were falsified. Says the bishop's men are coming down to audit everything." Melling stiffened. "That man will never forgive me for questioning his renovations."
"He wanted electric chimes, for heaven's sake."
"Ah," Purbright murmured. "Progress, the last refuge of the aggrieved. Don't trouble yourself, Reverend. Mr. Dane will find another institution to improve. There's a vacancy on the sanitation board, I believe." Mrs. Melling's composure softened. "You make it sound as though everything can simply go on." "It can," Purbright said.
"And it will."
"In towns like this, things always go on. Time doesn't heal, Mrs. Melling. It forgets selectively." He rose then, adjusting his hat. "One last matter, though. I should advise that you keep the church keys properly accounted for."
Locks and consciences share one weakness. They rarely hold if handled by too many hands. The Reverend smiled faintly.
"We'll remember." As they left the vicarage, Love exhaled heavily. "You're letting them off easy, sir." "Am I?" Purbright said, pausing by the garden gate. "They've still got to live here."
"That's punishment enough."
Nothing corrodes faster than pity, and this town has already begun to polish theirs. They crossed the square toward the church, its tower bright against the pale afternoon. The bell rope hung ready, motionless in the draught. Purbright glanced up.
"Do you know, love, I've been wondering about that first morning."
When the bell failed.
Everyone assumed something had broken.
But what if the real purpose was to prevent it from ringing at all?
Love frowned.
"Prevent what, sir?"
"An announcement," Purbright said quietly.
The fair marked the start of the parish accounts inspection, didn't it? That bell was meant to call attention to begin proceedings.
And someone somewhere decided the less said, the better, so she cut the rope. Yes, Purbright said.
A wife silenced a bell to buy her husband's dignity a few hours more. There's poetry in that, though not much justice. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the town. Somewhere a child laughed. A cart rattled past on the cobbles.
A dog barked at nothing.
The world, as ever, continued untroubled. At last, Purbright turned back toward the station. Come along, love. Reports don't write themselves. And I find truth sits more comfortably in ink than in memory. Love followed, glancing once over his shoulder at the tower. You really think they'll be all right, sir? Purbright's reply was almost a murmur. No one in Flaxborough is ever entirely all right, love, but most learn to appear so. It's a civic virtue. The bell tolled once as if to confirm it, deep, measured, and finally obedient. Its echo faded over the rooftops, leaving behind a silence that for once felt earned. By the end of that week, Flaxborough had done what it did best. It absorbed scandal the way its cobblestones absorbed rain, quietly and without ceremony. The vicarage bell now rang dutifully again, its tone lighter somehow, as if relieved of its burden. No one spoke of its former silence anymore, except in half-hearted jokes at the grocer's or as a moral anecdote in the Women's Guild. Reverend Melling's sermon that Sunday was described as moving by those who hadn't listened closely and mercifully brief by those who had. The congregation was pleased to see him restored to composure, and even more pleased to see that their own part in the whole affair required no further examination. Inspector Purbright attended, as he sometimes did when the air of self-satisfaction in town required observation. He sat at the back, his hat resting on his knees, his eyes wandering more often than his mind. The church was filled with the soft shuffle of hymnals, the faint perfume of damp wool, and the comforting rustle of communal virtue. He noted with mild amusement that the collection plate returned heavier than usual. Guilt, he reflected, was the most dependable fundraiser in any parish. After the service, he lingered by the gate, exchanging the usual pleasantries. Mrs. Teasle approached with the air of one bestowing grace.
Inspector, we're all so relieved it's over.
Poor Reverend Melling, he looks positively renewed, doesn't he? And Mrs. Melling, dear soul, such quiet dignity. Indeed, Purbright said. Silence, Mrs. Teasle, is a much underrated form of eloquence. Oh, that's true enough, she agreed, not entirely sure what he meant, but unwilling to risk disagreement. Of course, there's always one or two who'll keep gossiping. But that's human nature, isn't it? Purbright smiled, the only aspect of it that never fails. He watched her march off toward the post office, already preparing a slightly revised version of the conversation for her afternoon callers. Across the churchyard, the Mellings stood together beside the path, their posture almost natural again. The Reverend spoke to parishioners with mild civility. His wife kept a small, steady smile fixed upon her face. When their eyes met his, she offered a brief nod. Grateful, unspoken, final. By mid-week, the story had diminished to a footnote. Councillor Chubb had resumed his campaign for modernization, loudly proposing a new clock mechanism for the tower to bring the church in step with the 20th century. Mr. Larch, the organist, had taken to composing a hymn titled The Peal Restored, which he described as both commemorative and forward-looking, though no one seemed keen to hear it. And Mrs. Pargeter, whose honey stall had suffered briefly during the scandal, reported record sales, proof, she claimed, that sweetness triumphs over sin every time. At the police station, calm returned as well. Love finished typing the final report and handed it across the desk. Case closed, sir. Filed under parochial disturbance. No further action. Rather a quiet ending, if you ask me. The best kind, Purbright said, signing his name with slow precision. A noisy ending implies comprehension, and that would be quite out of character for Flaxborough. Love grinned. Still, it's nice when people make peace, even if they don't quite deserve it. Purbright regarded him for a moment. Peace, love, is rarely deserved. It's simply granted when everyone's too tired to argue. He leaned back, the faintest smile touching his mouth. Besides, the town needed something to occupy its nerves.
One can't gossip indefinitely about the price of bread. True enough, said Love, reaching for his coat.
You'll be going home soon, sir?
In a while, Purbright murmured.
There's a certain pleasure in seeing a case return to dust before one's eyes. When Love had gone, the office fell into the companionable quiet of early evening. The sound of the clock on the wall blended with the faint hum of traffic beyond the window. Purbright took a moment to straighten the papers on his desk, his fingers lingering briefly over the folder marked Vicarage Incident. Then he closed it, slid it neatly into the drawer, and locked it away. He sat for a while longer, his gaze resting on nothing in particular. In the corner of his mind, small details still assembled themselves. The neat slice of the rope, the half-burned note in the grate, the way Mrs. Melling's voice trembled, not from fear, but from relief. There were no more questions to ask, and yet questions remained, as they always did. He thought of Reverend Melling, continuing his rounds, shaking hands, blessing infants, preaching contrition to those who preferred to borrow it second-hand. He thought, too, of Mrs. Melling, of her delicate calm, her fragile sense of purpose, her unspoken understanding that peace must sometimes be purchased with deception. It was not heroism nor even folly. It was simply life as lived in Flaxborough, where the line between kindness and concealment had long since blurred into habit. At last, Purbright rose and fetched his coat. Outside, the evening had folded itself gently over the town. The lamplighters' rounds had already begun, each small flame awakening with deliberate care. The air smelled faintly of rain and coal smoke. He walked without hurry past the church, pausing for a moment at the gate. The bell, obedient as ever, gave a single chime, soft, courteous, almost apologetic. Purbright tilted his head, listening until the echo dissolved into the stillness. Then, with the faintest murmur to himself, he said, "Well done, old friend. You've learned when not to speak." He turned toward the square, where the windows of the Crown and Cushion glowed amber against the dusk. The day's last voices drifted from within, laughter, trivial talk, the comfortable sound of a town settling back into its own skin. It was all as it had been before, though nothing, of course, was quite the same. Purbright crossed the cobbles and disappeared into the lamplight, the faint rhythm of his footsteps blending with the easy breathing of the town he understood so well and trusted so little. And behind him, St. Botolph's bell, repaired, restrained, redeemed, kept its silent watch over the vicarage that no longer needed to hide.